What about women in literature? What changes have taken place here since 1900? And as we'll see in a later video, this was women's role in society, in literature was a important issue for the likes of Virginia Woolf as well. Well, what's notable now is that there are many more women authors than there used to be, and most of them write under their own, or at least a female name. This wasn't the case even as late as the 19th century. Many major women writers, at least in Britain, and at least initially, wrote either anonymously or under a male name. You may have heard of the Bronte sisters. They first published their works under male names as Currer Ellis and Acton Bell. Mary Shelley, when she wrote Frankenstein, the novel Frankenstein, she first published it anonymously, and it was assumed it was by a man. When it was discovered that it was by a woman, society was utterly shocked that a woman could have had such dreadful imaginings. Another famous British writer at the end of the 19th century, we know her as George Eliot, but that of course is her pseudonym, a male name to cover the fact she was of course a female author. Now this kind of thing doesn't happen so much now, although it's interesting that the author of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling, chose to use initials rather than her first name, partially to conceal her gender. Also, the respect that is paid to women's writing and women's contribution to culture and society has heightened in the 20th century and was reflected in the growth of study programs at universities and colleges, specifically on, for example, women in history, women in culture, women's writing, and feminist criticism. Now, it's important to be aware, or to point out, that women's studies tend to have two different approaches, although sometimes, of course, they combine the two, a different focus. One approach of women's studies is to look specifically at women in history, women in culture, and women in literature. The other approach, which sometimes runs alongside this, sometimes separately, is to look at history, culture and literature in general, but from a specifically female perspective. Now there are pros and cons in all of these approaches. What, for example, is the value of studying women's history? Why not just study history? Well, this would go back to what I said in the previous video about the assumption that there's an elision between the male point of view and the universal objective point of view. Whereas what women activists, writers and others pointed out at the start of the 20th century is that this supposedly objective universal account of the world and account of history was actually very heavily male biased. So by looking at women's history, we can give a more balanced and alternative kind of history. We can expose the basic assumptions that have gone into the male writing of history. And similar things could be said about studying women's writing as well, or women in writing, that women writers have tended, or prior certainly to the second half of the 20th century, tended to be downgraded, as somehow treated as not so important as male writing. So by having courses specifically focusing on women's writers, it was a way of highlighting actually the quality of that kind of writing. And again, looking at literature by men, looking at the depiction of women in works produced by men, was a useful way of examining the different ways in which men have presented and understood women, which of course is generally tied up with the prevailing ideologies of the culture at the time. So of course there are many positive things one can say about the explosion of these kinds of courses, this greater focus on women's contribution to culture, but also on women's perspectives on the culture that has emerged. There are, though, some dangers as well. We need to be cautious of these. It becomes too easy then, if you focus on women's writing about women, to give the impression that you assume that women can and only will write about women. They somehow have nothing else to talk about, whereas men are free to cover any topics they like. According to this point of view, women are not. This again is something that Virginia Woolf was very eager to overcome. She felt that women necessarily wrote about women's experience to begin with, partly because their opportunities in society were so limited and they saw so little of the world that they didn't really have any other choice. But she looked forward to a day when women would in a way transcend gender and become almost androgynous in their mind and just write about anything whatsoever without necessarily considering gender. And I do want to emphasize that even though we are looking at 3 women's authors this week, and particularly focusing on what they have to say about gender and sex issues, this is not to imply that this is the only thing these authors have to write about, or indeed that the works we're studying discuss. So it is very important to bear that in mind. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you can see that one of the things that has emerged in the 20th century is this notion of écriture féminine. This is a French label, of course. It doesn't translate directly into English. We would normally translate it as women's literature, or women's writing rather. But what it tries to focus upon is the idea of perhaps there may or should be a distinctively female way of writing. Now, this goes back to another idea that I brought up in the previous video, which is that language reflects the patriarchal structure and belief system of our societies. That just as society, especially at the start of the 20th century, was very much male-dominated, male-oriented, saw things from male perspective, so the language that was used reflected this. And I mentioned, for example, the use of mankind to reflect humans as a whole, or of talking about the reader, assuming that a reader, or any person you may be talking about in general, is male. But the notion of écriture féminine perceives a much more fundamental gender bias in language than this. From this point of view, language basically has become male. This is often called the phallocentric point of view, obviously focusing on the male anatomy. Although sometimes the term phallogocentric is used instead. Logos is language, so it's that language is organized around the male body and the male perspective. And many thinkers, particularly in France actually, but the French thinkers have had a huge influence on the English-speaking world, so it's very relevant for our course too. They have asked, well, if language is so fundamentally male-dominated, is there any way in which we can develop a language which is distinctively female? And those who've pursued this idea have, just as they associate male language, the phallocentric language, with the male body, they've tried to evolve or describe a kind of language that is much closer to the female body. Now, as you can imagine, this has been extremely controversial, but nonetheless we need to be aware of it. And loosely speaking, they would say that whereas language for men is single and hard, as it were, and this is the idea that males have just one erogenous zone, females, on the other hand, have many, and also the female anatomy, the female body, is more fluid than the male. So whereas male writing is sort of hard and fixed and rigid, female writing is more fluid and multiple, perhaps more difficult to grasp hold of. Now, as I said, this is extremely controversial amongst feminists as much as anybody else. But I just want to read to you a short passage by Virginia Woolf. It's not on the reading list, but it's relevant to this topic to show really how this thinking has been. It wasn't labelled écriture féminine when Woolf was working, but she is writing at the cusp of the 20th century when all these developments for women are taking place, and she's very much reflecting upon the issue of language and writing as well. Now that women have more chance to become writers, are they going to write the same things as men? And above all, are they going to write in the same way? And in the passage I'm going to read now from A Room of One's Own, she's really talking about how men have sort of had access to culture and self-expression for such a long period of time that they've acquired a certain confidence. There's a certain power in their use of language which isn't really available to women of her period. So I'm quoting now. She says, "All the great novelists like Thackeray and Dickens and Balzac have written a natural prose, swift but not slovenly, expressive but not precious, taking their own tint without ceasing to be common property." In other words, this is something to which all men have access and they can put their own personal stamp on it, but still it's an established system. They have based it on the sentence that was current at the time. The sentence that was current at the beginning of the 19th century ran something like this perhaps, and now she makes up a sentence. The grandeur of their works was an argument with them, not to stop short, but to proceed. They could have no higher excitement or satisfaction than in the exercise of their art and the endless generations of truth and beauty. Success prompts to exertion, and habit facilitates success. End of Woolf's quotation. Then she continues, "That is a man's sentence. Behind it one can see Johnson, Gibbon and the rest." In other words, there's a history going back beyond the 18th century of writers that make it possible for men to talk and speak in this way. And then she continues, "It was a sentence that was unsuited for a woman's use." Charlotte Bronte, one of the great women writers of the 19th century, with all her splendid gift for prose, stumbled and fell with that clumsy weapon in her hands. George Eliot, another great woman writer from the 19th century, committed atrocities with it that beggar description. In other words, once women finally get the opportunity to write literature, they find that literature itself as an industry, the kind of things people expect, but not just what they write about, how the writing is done, doesn't really work for them, doesn't really offer them a language that adequately describes the world as they themselves see it. So this is in a way the back history to this concept of écriture féminine. And there's perhaps a hint at this too in a passage from Woolf, which is on your reading list, the penultimate page of Professions for Women, where she talks about how in order to become a woman writer, she had to go through two important experiences. One of them was killing off the angel in the house, which she thinks that she solved. And then she describes the second one. Here are her own words. The second was, quote, "telling the truth about my own experiences as a body." And then she goes on to say she does not think she's solved that. So how do you find a form of writing that reflects the experience of being a woman in the world in Virginia Woolf's situation at that period of time? So we need to pay attention to not just to what people write about, but also how they write about them.